Who is George Floyd? What is George Floyd? Where is George Floyd? Is he a hero? An angel? A saint? Some call him a criminal, whose death was just one of many. Some call him the face of a movement, whose martyrdom represents the many. But what if I told you that neither story is true? The Jewish elites don't want you to know the true story, but today I'm going to tell it to you in full detail. The story I'm going to tell you takes place in the world of Kenshi. It is the story of a man who started from poverty and complete obscurity, but rose to conquer nations, to free all the captives in the land, and found a nation of liberated slaves where he ruled as a mighty king. This is the legend of George Floyd. At the beginning of our tale, George Floyd was not the household name that he is today. He was nothing but a poor miner who labored hard throughout the day just to save up for a shirt to cover his back from the oppressive rays of the midday sun. But day after day he labored, chipping away not only at the copper in the ground, but also at his poverty. As he worked, he dreamt of a land that was not yet, but surely would be. And as he dreamt, he composed songs, spirituals, that would one day be sung by liberated captives in the land of his dreams. After saving enough funds for a journey, George Floyd took his money bag and set off for a nearby city called Squin, where he believed he might find noble hearts worthy to join him in his cause. He traveled through the night at a brisk pace, combating the heaviness of his eyes with the flaming sword of his determination. Upon his arrival at Squin, he rented a bed at the inn and took a well-earned rest. The next day he went back to work, but it wasn't long before local bandits came looking for trouble. They were able to injure his body, but as he fled to safety, he felt his soul come alive. He knew at that moment that even the fiercest threat could not stand in the way of his holy mission. The moment he regained his strength, George Floyd rose and immediately began training in the way of the sword, training at full intensity the whole night through. Never again would he allow himself to appear weak before his foes. When morning came, he once again pushed through the heaviness of his eyes to toil through the day. After collecting enough copper, he was finally able to afford to hire his first companion to join him on his journey. So he walked swiftly to the bar and scouted out its many patrons, searching for any that were pure of heart. It was then that he met LaFonda, a hulking shack of a woman, of much strength and girth, in both body and soul, whom he instantly knew would play an essential role in the divine plan. So LaFonda joined him in his humble labors, working as long as the sun still peaked his head above the horizon. But as when George was on his own, it would not be long before the bandits would return to once again attempt to thwart his sacred purpose. The two fought valiantly against the many, but it was nonetheless proven once again that George Floyd had not yet acquired the fierce might necessary to take on the world. Yet these attacks did not happen without purpose. As with each blow he received, an impenetrable resilience burned within him, which one day would not be able to be quenched by even the mightiest of waves. But in order to remind him of his present weakness, slavers were ordained to come and put LaFonda in chains, which George Floyd was powerless to prevent. But in the providence of the Almighty, the slavers became engaged in combat with bandits, buying George some time to bind his wounds in return in greater strength. Yet while George was away, the slavers fell in battle. Over the course of his trip into town, LaFonda came to and hobbled about looking for a place to hide. She entered town and crouched behind a building until she and George were reunited. That night, the pair decided to fully devote themselves to becoming mighty in battle. They each flung a corpse over their shoulder and ran through the wilderness all night to build up their strength, a feat which they accomplished at a miraculous rate. To increase the weight they carried throughout the day and maximize their gains, they bought backpacks and mined the whole day through to stuff them full of heavy iron. And when the night returned, they trained their hands to better wield the blade. Early the next morning, they began testing their skills on weak enemies. Yes, that man is an escaped slave with no weapon and still in chains, but sometimes people must suffer for the greater good. They displayed progress, but still required much further training. The next night, they walked back and forth through the city street, carrying corpses in their backpacks full of iron, making great gains as the night progressed. And in the morning, they added a new midget-sized member to the $20 club named Georgina. The trio continued the grind, setting their hopes on the fruitful land of George's dreams, and singing the songs he had composed in the days when he swung his pickaxe alone. Their sweet melodies were interrupted by yet another group of bandits, and while they were greatly beaten, a mighty resilience took root even deeper than the weapons of the enemy could pierce. After the battle, they witnessed the first sign of George Floyd's miraculous powers when it was discovered that his backpack full of all the iron they had acquired that day had phased into the boulder, never to return. But they took this as a sign that it was not strength that was to be sought above all, but rather contentment in all things. They returned to the inn and rested, recovering from the injuries they had sustained. And the next day they managed to mine enough iron to fill each of their backpacks, so that their gains could finally be maximized. And upon their return to town that night, they happened upon some hostile Garu, who they felled in battle with the help of the city guards. Now that they had given up their desire for strength above all else, Providence had now granted them the perfect corpses to carry on their backs. And once again they traveled to and fro upon the city street, getting mightier with each step. Growing tired of treading the same ground repeatedly, they then took to the slopes of the wasteland. But once again, the danger of the outside world taught them an important lesson. They had grown impatient and went back into the perilous world before their training was complete. And once again, they were defeated in battle. The injuries they had sustained were greater than before, and they had traveled too far from the town to easily return. So they rested, hoping that one of them would regain just enough strength to retrieve supplies and return to help the others. George Floyd was the first to wake, but he was immediately met by another group of bandits, who left him in an even worse state than before. Thus, it was up to LaFonda to hobble back to town, now with George's life at stake should she fail to return in haste. By nightfall, she had acquired the supplies and was swiftly on her way back to her fallen companions. And as the sun began to climb back over the eastern horizon, she returned to tend to the greatly wounded George Floyd. They found themselves back in beds atop the inn, again recovering from battles undertaken beyond their abilities. When they awoke, it was discovered that George Floyd had now become a monoped. With their leader now immobilized, the $20 club decided to add a new member to the crew, a former architect wishing to move out of his parents' basement, George Costanza. Having heard of a city in the midst of the perilous foglands which has mechanical legs, they made the decision to journey to get their leader back on his feet again. So they set off with great haste, carrying George Floyd, who was forced now more than ever to rely upon others in times of weakness. In their first battle along the way, George Costanza's boasts of masterful martial arts skills were discovered to be greatly exaggerated, and he proved to be of little use in combat. While the others fought, he attempted to flee, but to no avail. As punishment, He was forced to take laps with George Floyd flung over his shoulder and all the supplies in his backpack, while LaFonda recovered from her injuries. Once everyone was fully recovered, they resumed their journey. They passed through dusty deserts, carefully avoiding any more run-ins with hungry bandits. They passed through a land of strange fauna, keeping their distance from the large, long-necked beak things to avoid becoming their next meal. Finally, they made it to the Fog Islands, feeling relief in their aching feet, knowing Mongrel was near, yet all the while increasing in fear knowing the Fogmen were also near. They crouched amidst the white fog, glancing in every direction for any shadows that might emerge from the pale cloud that surrounded them. But somehow, they had passed safely through danger and made it safely to the city of Mongrel. They went immediately into the robotics shop to inquire about the price of a top-tier leg for their leader. Their hearts sank as they discovered that, despite the thousands they had acquired through mining, they were still far off from being able to afford a new leg for George Floyd. So back to the mines they went, and for the first time encountered the vicious Fogmen. Fortunately, they were close enough to the city for the guards to come to their aid, and at the end of the battle, they met a new friend, who was now also missing a leg just like George Floyd. So they added Beep to the crew. While the cripples were resting at the inn, the 3 remaining bipeds worked away to save up for 2 new legs. But as usual, they could not get much work done before trouble would come knocking. Not wishing to overestimate their abilities, they fled back into town and let the guards take care of the Fogmen. Meanwhile, back at the inn, the 2 amputees were losing hope in the crew's plan to get them their legs. So they began hatching a plan of their own to get things moving more quickly. As the 2 set off, the bipeds finally began experiencing success with their mining. The city guards had managed to fight off the Fogmen in the distance for an entire day, allowing the crew to gather up an abundance of copper and peace. At this point, the amputees had finally made it down the stairs, and their plan had now commenced. George Floyd had relied on the others for too long, and now it was time for him to act. He refused to let his monopedal state hold him back from his destiny. George Floyd and Beep crawled slowly across town, gathering dust upon their bodies to remind them whence they came and whither they shall return. They slid stealthily into the robotics shop and began their tactical maneuver. Beep created a diversion by closing the door, drawing the shopkeeper to walk over to close it. Meanwhile, George Floyd waited for an opportune moment and reached into the box of legs, successfully grabbing a leg for Beep without being detected. He reached in yet again to grab a leg for himself, but did not encounter the same success, and the alarm was raised immediately. But to his surprise, he found that the authorities were cut to heart by the pitiable sight of a monoped dragging his mangled body across the floor, with his clothes covered in dust and his skin full of splinters from the aged floorboards. Thus, they refused to put a stop to his series of crimes, and he was able to escape their sight until another opportune moment. But the first leg was a perfect fit for Beep, and he ran in elated circles as he celebrated his return to the bipedal way of life. George Floyd tried another time, and again it was a failure. He tried once more, and again his efforts were thwarted. He tried yet another time, and this time he went unnoticed, and finally he too was bipedal once again. The duo, made brothers in monopedal unity, were now standing on 2 feet and ready to take on the world. The 2 less experienced members were sent to the barracks to train their combat skills, while the others went back out to the mines, where they yet again were forced to defend themselves against threats that emerged from the fog. But with the restoration of George Floyd's leadership, they found themselves finally gaining the upper hand in battle, resulting in their first victory. Once the new members had sufficiently trained their combat skills, the whole team was finally together at maximum efficiency as they extracted the riches of the earth. And together they sang the songs that George Floyd had composed in his lonesome, the songs of a new world, a world of justice, liberty, and peace. After selling their copper, They were now able to afford armor to replace Beep's rags, and now he was a force to be reckoned with. So the clan, with a newfound strength, set out, now on the offense against the Fogmen, seeking vengeance for the many attacks they had weathered. Together they cut down Fogman after Fogman, finally experiencing the fruits of their many hours of training by moonlight with corpse flung over shoulder. Many Fogmen fell that day at the hands of the $20 club, and at the end of the day, they had the head of a Fog Prince to trade in for a lofty bounty. Thus concludes the beginning of the legend of George Floyd. If his small crew could now take on the savages of Fog Islands after only a couple weeks, who knows what foes he could take on in just a matter of time. Tune in next time and make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to see what higher heights of greatness will be achieved by George Floyd and his $20 club. Beep created a